I'm Sue Peters. I'm a Green. I've been Green for a number of years. Right now I'm a member of my Manhattan local. I live in New York. I'm also a delegate to the New York State, our committee, our national committee, state committee. And I'm also a Green that's worked with 4 or 5 other Greens from around the country for the last 3 or 4 years to create a website called greensformonetaryreform.org. And our website, we built it because we felt it was necessary to explain to the Green Party members this incredible platform that we have currently in our national platform. And the thinking about our money system in this country is kept out of our schools. It's not taught. Economics is taught, but economics doesn't want to really deal with where our money comes from and who controls the creation of it. It's also not discussed in our media. So we felt like there was a need to educate the Green Party because that platform, greening the dollar, is very important for funding whatever human needs are found in our platform to fund. If you, one of the founders of the American Monetary Institute, he always said, over time, whoever controls the money controls the society. So I'm going to show you today, this is all from Greening the Dollar. It's from the American Monetary Institute, was instrumental for educating Greens to get it into the national platform. And there's a long history of public control of our money in the United States, which was also not done. So I'm going to touch on that. Okay. Oh, and just to say, I worked for 35 years on Wall Street. In the last 15, I worked for a multinational commercial bank. And I didn't learn this at the bank, but I discovered it while I was working at the bank. And it really revolutionized the way I thought of myself working at the bank and what was going on around me. So, okay. So, okay. Carl Herman, 2012. The U.S. doesn't have a money supply, but it's Orwellian opposite of a debt supply. We live in a debt money system. Banks and the Fed create what we use for money as debt, then charge us interest for its use. That's our system. The private commercial banks create our money and charge us interest on it. It's bizarre. Here was Aristotle, who said very basically, for money was intended to be used in exchange, but not to increase in interest. Our money should not be attached to any form of debt. It's there to facilitate the transfer of goods and services that we all need to have a basic, decent life, which is what we Greens want to give our country. And this is the founder, Stephen Zarlenga, of the American Monetary Institute, who said, over time, whoever controls the money system controls the nation. And he said that he wrote a book called The Lost Science of Money, which looked through history, the world history, and interpreted the history from the point of view of, in that civilization, who is controlling the money? And it gives you a whole other view of what was going on in the world and is going on today. Okay. And Marshall McLuhan said only the small secrets need to be protected, the large ones are kept secret by public incredulity. And I know that some of you in this room will feel incredulous to find out what our system is currently today in this country. Ed Coleridge from the Northeast Ohio American Friends Service Committee said, the general public is unwilling or unable to believe that the vast majority of the money of our nation is not created by our public government, but by private financial entities out of thin air as debt. And they do that with bookkeeping. It's all done in our checking accounts as bookkeeping entries. And they create it as a debt. And anybody, whether it's a person, a corporation, a government, goes to a private commercial bank in this country and asks for a loan, the bank will say, okay, I'll give you the loan, and creates the bookkeeping entry, creates the deposit in the borrower's account. It's creation of what we use as money. Most of our money is in our checking account. Right? So I'm going to talk about two things. First, the system, the basics of it, and its consequences, which are all around us. And here's Mr. Einstein's going to help us. Listen. Meet the system. Private banks create the money we need. That's a very important word, create. Didn't exist before. They created. You don't have to believe me. Here. Oh, this is me when I first, literally, when I first learned the system. I couldn't believe it. I ran into the bank, and I went to this, I had done this program creating this overdraft report for our corporate customers. And I realized overdrafts are loans from a bank when you get an overdraft. And it was just creating it out of thin air. It was like, well, out of bookkeeping entry. But that was me. It took me 6 months to integrate it. You don't have to believe me. Here, listen to others. Here is Robert Anderson, Secretary of the Treasury under Eisenhower. Quote, when a bank makes a loan, it simply adds to the borrower's deposit account in the bank by the amount of the loan. The money is not taken from anyone else's deposit. It's new money created by the bank for the use of the borrower. Very hard concept. It took me, I was busy trying to integrate it into my thinking. And here's Mariner Eccles. He was chairman of the Fed under Roosevelt. Well, that is what our money system is. If there were no debts in our money system, there wouldn't be any money. Because the money is created whenever the bank gives a loan to a person, a corporation, a government. So if all those loans get paid off, we don't have any money. Let's look at how does it work. Okay. So when the private bank makes a loan, it creates money, and the money supply grows. Right? We need that money supply. That's how we get our needs met, get our goods and services transferred. When the loan is repaid to the bank, the money disappears. They take it off the bookkeeping. First they put it into the bookkeeping, into your account, and then you pay the principal of the loan, and they erase it. That's how the bookkeeping is done. And that means that, bookkeeping is our lifeblood. We need that money. We need to earn it. We need to spend it in order to live. What? This can't be. We all need that money. It mustn't go away. Of course, we know that every borrower must pay interest, right? This is a banks of profit-making corporations. The problem is that banks never create the money for the interest. Now, this was built into the system by the people who designed the system. This is a designed system. the bankers who created the Federal Reserve Law in 1913, they actually wrote it in 1910. They knew what they were doing. Some of them had come from Europe, where they had this system. This system that I'm telling you about started with the private Bank of England in 1694. I'm touching this thing.
Stay away.
I know. This exact system was created by the private Bank of England, those financiers, in 1694, when they got their charter for the Bank of England from Parliament. And of course, the first thing they did was they created their money, back then it was banknotes. They created their banknotes and went into Parliament and bribed the MPs, because their charter was given to them by Parliament. They had to be sure they weren't going to get it taken away. The same thing happens in this country. The power is in the hands of these private commercial banks. They have used that money that they create to go into the hall of our Congress and buy our Congress. And we're not going to get our Congress back until we change this system. That's my opinion. So, the interest is never created, so think about it. We have all these loans out. Everybody has to pay the principal, but also we have to find the interest. It's not there. What an interesting, clever thing that they thought of, the bankers. Because, why did they design it that way? It's not moving. What did I do? Is anyone technical here? Oh, good. Okay. Since the money for interest is never created, money is always scarce, right? Everyone's working, we're working our asses off to make the money so we can, have food, but also to pay the bank, the credit card, the mortgage, whatever loan you have, right? And you gotta have interest, you have to find the interest, but it's not there. So everybody's fighting to find that interest that doesn't exist. They built it like that, they designed it like that. It's brilliant, brilliant if you think about it, because we're the losers. We're always the losers, we're always the winners. Right? Because if we can't pay our loans, they come in and they take our property, right? Or our car or our home or whatever. So what do we have to do? Go into deeper and deeper debt. How many people, take their credit cards and try to figure out, how I can move it around, and, this is the amount of debt today in the United States compared to what it was in 1980 is astronomical. They're like the people who run this system and who just designed it. They do everything, with a slow timeline. It's like a frog. You put a frog in a pot and you put a low heat over it. And it's very incremental because they want to remain hidden. They don't want the system taken away from them. So they're not going to do anything. Well, in 2008. Look what happened then, right? They were bailed out because they're so central to our livelihoods, our living, our country functioning. But 2008 was quite painful for so many people in our country. And I think that there's, slowly that pain has been covered up by the media and covered up by, the people who try to, talk to the American public. But it's there and it's getting worse. And I was totally surprised my first time to Salt Lake City to find so many homeless downtown. mean, to me, it's a reflection of this system and rising level of debt and more people who can't make it. And it's meant to keep people in poverty. You know. Or, right, either you get another loan or the bank gets you wealth, they call it, no matter what we call it, our wealth, our house, our car. Think of the amount of student debt. Now, we didn't have, really had student debt back in 1980. The laws were changed, and look at the amount of debt that our students are in. In other words, the bankers have targeted our younger generation. If you keep people in debt slavery for the rest of their life, they're working to pay off the banks as well as get some subsistence to their life. That's really what this system is about. The system demands that more loans be created, or else the money supply shrinks and there will be defaults, foreclosures, bankruptcies, unemployment, recessions, depression. This was very evident in the 1930s with the Great Depression. That was caused by this system. It was evident in 2008, but there have been many recessions and crises in this system. There's no stability here at all. The bankers decide who gets money. They're deciding that, like who are they going to give a loan to? It's a private decision by private corporate entities. It's not, a public decision. And they decide how much. I have a friend. She worked for a French multinational bank for 10 years. She's a farmer, but she had to get money in order to start her farm. So she became a secretary in this French bank down on 8th Avenue in Manhattan. And she said she worked 10 years, and she was responsible, and all the other secretaries were responsible for typing up the loan agreements that the bank was making. And she said there was never one loan agreement in the whole 10 years that was less than $1 billion. So this money that this system is creating, this private system, is flooding out to who they want it to go to. And most of that money is going to the corporations. Because most corporations, I'm not going to talk about the few very big ones, but any corporation in this country needs bank loans in order to function. And this is where it's coming from, this corrupt, cruel, private system that they don't want us to know about. So, I say that the private bank money system is the root cause and driver of corporate capitalism. And I taught a course in this, a private course, in this whole system for a couple of years. And the students were great. And this one student, I just love this, he said, this is capitalism's most essential feature and completely missing from the study and definition of capitalism. And I thought, Marvin, you're brilliant. He just said it one day, after we were studying the whole history of this system, So, whatever your interest is in changing in this country, I have a lot of friends who are farmers. This system empowers factory farming. They get the loans. They're supported. Family farmers since 1950 have been slowly driven out of our economy. They're still there, but very reduced and having a lot of problems. But these factory farms can always get loans. And they're getting it in a big way today. and it empowers all those multinationals who destroy our environment. Who gets, the oil and gas industry gets loans. They destroy our rainforests, they destroy our land, the mining, big mining companies. You have a big hole here in Salt Lake City. I think it was, someone was saying to me the other day that it used to be Kennecott, but now it was bought by Tinto Rio, big multinational. I mean, you could go. It's very interesting. If it's a public company, publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange and other exchanges, you can go into the SEC, Security and Exchange Commission, and they have, you can look at their balance sheet and just look for how much debt they're in. And then if you look in the notes, they tell you which of the Wall Street banks have given them their loans. It's really fascinating, you know. Yeah. And it funds wars. So, a lot of the loans that they're creating go to weapons manufacturers. I did a study on the nuclear power weapons manufacturers. It was based on a study in Amsterdam, and they traced the loans to Wall Street banks, you know, for pushing nuclear power, nuclear weapons. It was specifically nuclear weapons. The Fed and its member banks are these private commercial banks, right? They own the Fed. They are the single largest owner of U.S. bonds. It's not China. China has a lot. But when you look at the single largest owner, it's these commercial banks and the Fed itself, Fed's balance sheet. But the system can be changed. It's been changed a number of times in our country's history. Okay, so Greening the Dollar, which is our platform, our current platform, is based on the work of respected U.S. economists. So we had the Great Depression in the 30s, terrible. There were certain economists who got together and actually wrote this program for monetary reform. Here's the 6 of them. And they actually gave it to Roosevelt during the 30s. And they wanted him to consider it and use their system instead of what we have today. And he did not do that. If you know his background, was not that surprising that he wouldn't take this step. But this was submitted to U.S. economists for their approval by these 6 economists. And over 400 economists publicly supported this program. You can also hear it called the Chicago Plan. Right? I don't know if any other group of economists have ever supported a plan that they felt was needed. This is a quote from that plan. The banks thus exercise what has always and justly been considered a prerogative of sovereign power. As each bank exercises this power independently without any centralized control, the resulting changes in the volume of the circulating medium, that's our money supply, are largely haphazard. This situation is a most important factor in booms and depressions. They were pointing the finger at this private bank money system. And this is Dennis Kucinich. He was very brave. He worked with the American Monetary Institute to take what basically is our Greening the Dollar platform and put it as a bill into Congress. He was a representative at the time. And the bill was written and it was vetted by the congressional legal staff. So if a congressman wants to create a bill, he can use the legal staff to vet it, and they can see how it fits into the current laws and suggest modification. So that, it took 2 years, it went through, and he submitted it in 2010, and then he resubmitted it in 2011. It's called HR 2990, the NEED Act. I suggest you can read it, it's very readable. And he did this not because he thought it was going to pass Congress, because not enough people know, but he did it to educate the American public, to say, hey, this is what is working currently in our country. And it has 3 parts. The first part is you take the power to create money away from private commercial banks. And that's simply done with the bookkeeping change. I've done a lot of, when I was working at the bank, I did a lot of government-required changes to our systems. And it would be very simple. I could do it for any bank that wanted me to do it. And change bookkeeping. And in other words, from day one, if this bill was passed, when the bank gives a loan, they have to go and take the money out of some investment account of some investor who says, I'll share the interest with the bank and the risk with the bank. I trust the bank. So here's my money for the loan, which we think today is what happens, but it's not. But that was what would happen after this bill is passed, right? We wouldn't have the instability of this current system, and we wouldn't have this being absolutely under the control of private money, private control, our whole economy. Can you hold the questions to the end? Write it down so everybody. So, using federal, state, and municipal levels of government, the money would be distributed. There'd be, at the municipal level, there'd be no interest loan of this debt-free money created by the government. So if Salt Lake City wanted to build a swimming pool, they wouldn't have to go into issue bonds and go into debt and pay interest on that. They could get a no-interest loan and pay that back without interest. The state level, the certain percentage, this bill said 25% of any new money that was going to be created would go direct to each of the states on a per capita basis, and the states would decide how to use it. And then there's also at the federal level passing the Green New Deal. We could think of passing that. Yeah. Because we wouldn't have to go into any more debt. We could create the money to do that. And built into this, into the creation of money by the government, which is the sovereign power, which is found in our Constitution, in the Congress. Of course, in the Federal Reserve, the law was given over to these private commercial banks. But with this bill, the Congress would take back that power. And the history of money and monetary systems in the U.S., the people today who work for the banks and don't want us to know about the system, you'll hear, oh, if the government has the power to create money, there'll be so much inflation, they'll just pay for everything. Well, if you actually read about the history, and I suggest a book by Stephen Zolander, The Lost Science of Money, you find out in our American history that every time our government created debt-free money, it never created any more than what was authorized by the legislature. There's never been a case. Even the Continental. Now the Continental was debt-free money issued by the Revolutionary Congress during the war. And you'll see it written in our textbooks. Oh, the Continental, it just went out, you know, they printed too many of them, and we had inflation, and, you know, it's a saying, I forget, something and a continental. But if you go back to the history, and I suggest that book because he worked 11 years researching the sources, you find out that what was actually going on is that during the Revolutionary War, the British were sending ships with counterfeit Continentals into the port of New York. And you could actually find these newspaper ads in New York City saying, come to this tavern between this time and that time and get your free Continentals. They were pushing them out in order to destroy the value of the revolutionary money. And they did the same thing in Europe. The banking people did the same thing in Europe with the French Revolution, like 20 years, 25 years later. The French, the revolutionaries printed debt-free government money called apanages. Well, up in London, the counterfeiters were counterfeiting them and bringing them down into France and distributing them in order to destroy the value of the French revolutionary money. And the British were really excellent at using that counterfeiting of money to destroy the people that they were fighting against. Very interesting. I have to say though, today though, the Bank of England was nationalized in 1946, so it's no longer private. And I don't think they're counterfeiting anybody's money. And this is the website that myself and around 4 or 5 other greens around the country. And I suggest, it's called greensformonetaryreform.org without any spaces. And you can find on it, it explains the problem, what I've been telling you. It explains the solution, which is greening the dollar, the READ Act. And it also explains the transition. How do you get from the current system to the new system, right? And that's very interesting because it's very possible. It just takes political will, and hopefully our Green Party will be able to affect that in the larger, with our larger, you know, systems. And this explains the book, and gives you, you can go and look at all the teaching materials. There's all PowerPoints from the history of the Law, Science, and Money book, and there's recordings of each of the class. You can hear the students discussing it and everything. And there's resources. That's it. Support greening the dollar. Okay, so I'll open it up for questions, and maybe we'll put some lights on. Is that okay?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe just. Okay. So we have enough time. So let's see, you had your hand first. What's your name?
Tim.
Tim.
So you kept mentioning what happened in 1980 that was so significant that caused us to suddenly balloon in debt?
Well, actually, the history of it goes back to, I don't know if people remember, in 1971, Richard Nixon went on TV and announced to the world, all the other countries, they know, that the U.S. was going to be taken off the gold standard internationally. You know, so, and he did that because Charles de Gaulle, you know, the dollars are being created really fast by the banks because of the Vietnam War. That was going on for a number of years. And so they were flooding Europe, these dollars, and they were coming into France and buying up all the French assets. And de Gaulle was really angry, and so he would collect the dollars from his citizens, and he'd take it over to the Fed in New York, and he'd say, I want my gold. And the gold was going down and down and down. And Nixon had to stop, you know, Europeans coming and wanting our gold for our dollars that we were printing in order to have this horrible war. We were printing. The banks were printing. The banks were creating money and giving loans to all those weapons manufacturers and empowering them, you know. So what happened then, we went off the gold standard, right? So that meant that these private banks could now create as much money as they wanted, because no one was going to come and take our gold out of our treasury. And they created more and more money, and that's why the debt, the private and public debt, from you can see at the middle of the 1970s, the private and public debt started going up like this. You know, I think, I'm trying to think of the year. 1980, I think the federal debt maybe was $500 billion. I mean, you know, now it's $20.4 trillion. Trillions. I mean, we don't talk about even billions anymore. We talk trillions. It's astronomical. And it's how they control us. The debt is how they control us. As, you know, yeah.
You mentioned
Can you
earlier.
say your name? Say your name.
Garrett.
Garrett, okay.
You mentioned earlier that I was saying how if this wasn't doing it, then the government would just print money. There'd be no control.
Right.
And you mentioned that there's been no record of that ever happening.
Not for our government.
I wonder if you might expand on that a little bit.
Well, I think I mentioned it. The first time our country issued debt-free public money from the legislature was our 13 colonies. I was really surprised when I started studying this to learn that the colonies kept private banks out of the colonies. And I read that and I said to myself, wait a minute, I live in Manhattan. There are banks all over the place. I've grown up with banks in this country. But the colonists knew this, they knew what private banks do with their bookkeeping, how they can create money. And they saw it in, they all came from Europe, and they saw the poverty in Europe. They saw all of that, and they were more clear thinking than we are. They didn't have, all the media we have telling us lies. And they said, no, we're not going to have private banks in the colonies. So eventually every single legislature of all 13 colonies issued private public notes that circulated and was the money. Because, the British money was gold and silver coins. Well, there wasn't very much in the colonies because the colonies had to buy things from Britain, they had to pay taxes to Britain, and Britain only wanted gold and silver coins, so that all went back to the mother country. So they were left with very little exchange medium, so it was a very creative idea they came up with to create their own money from their legislature, debt-free, and spend it, and it circulated. And Ben Franklin, he was great, he knew this system. He wrote a lot about it. And there's a description, he was talking, I think it was Philadelphia, and he said, before we had our public money, he said, there were all these homeless people in the colonies, and colonists were starting to go back to England, they couldn't make it. And he said, but now that we have our money, he said there's prosperity. He saw the difference. He said, everybody has a job. That was one big thing. Everybody has a place to live because of the money system. He was very instrumental in educating the different colonies about this, the solution to this money system that we had. And that was the first experience Americans had with debt-free public money. Then, of course, the Continental, which I spoke about, which was, you know, attacked by the British with counterfeiting. And then between 1781, at the end of the war, till our Constitution was passed in 1789, that decade, the states, now we were states, right? The states continued to create their own debt-free government money, and the Congress, the Articles of Confederation Congress continued with it. Then you had Alexander Hamilton come along with the Constitution, and he knew the debt money system, and he liked it. He wanted it. And this is the other thing I was so surprised at. I don't know if I can find it. But I was reading, he became our first Secretary of the Treasury. And he gave his first report to the new Congress as Secretary. And in it, he has this incredible description of exactly how the banks create money. And he said, and the credits, they write checks, and they go from one bank to the other. And he said, it's a beautiful system. I was so surprised when I read that. I know, but it's his words. It's I was in the New York, I live in New York, so I went to New York Public Library, and they had a database of all these documents, you know, from the beginning of our country. So, yeah.
Well, thanks for doing this workshop, Sue. It's a lot of good information. I'm wondering, you know, within the concept of green and the dollar, why would we need to buy the shares from the Federal Reserve banks? Why wouldn't we just abolish the Federal Reserve Act, you know, and ignore that debt, and then you know, print our own money, you know, issue it through state banks or something? Why would we continue to perpetuate the system that exists?
Well, I don't understand. By perpetuating these.
By buying the shares of the Federal Reserve banks, I'm wondering what the purpose of buying those shares is when we could just abolish the Federal Reserve and say the debt is invalid, and then begin to issue our own money via state banks or some other medium.
Well, this is my own personal feeling about it, is I feel like any changes should be legal. So this is a legal law that would be passed by our Congress, right, signed by our president. And if we're going to buy those shares now, the shares, you have to think of the Federal Reserve, the 12 Federal Reserve banks. They don't have any of our money. Our money is only found in private commercial bank accounts. That's where it is. They have what they call bank reserves in the Fed, and they're owned by the banks, the private commercial banks. And we're not we're into paying them for it, you know?
Might help clarify things to say that when we talk about buying the shares of those banks, what you're really saying is you're buying those banks.
The 12 Fed.
Yeah, you're nationalizing them. They then become part of the government. So it nationalizes the system. Those banks no longer exist as
And those
independent.
12 banks.
Those 12
The
banks.
private commercial banks they exist,
Yeah.
but they can't create money anymore. Thank you. Yes.
Rodolfo. So I'm actually one of the candidates for Congress. This is like really important for me to be exposed to this, so thank you for presenting the information. So what I'm curious about is, so, you know, there are a lot of schools of economics, you know, this being one of them. And
This is not economics. I have to stop you.
Sure.
It's a money system, a monetary system.
Okay, sure. Okay, so I have so just so that I can properly understand, you know, your perspective, I'm wondering about, so that slide that you showed, you know, you talked about the defense contractors, and how, so if we, you know, I think if we polled the public, you know, how do we pay for the military? Most people would probably say, well, taxation, our taxes fund the military. Here you're adding the component that, well, it's actually, well, you know, when perhaps Congress has talked about passing the budget for the military, it's actually the banks that are creating the money to go into Lockheed Martin, to go into Raytheon, and all the other ones. So you're adding that component. And there's other people that say, well, they're purchasing bonds and treasuries and all that.
Can I slow you down?
Sure.
Can you do it, say it a little slower, what do you think
Sure.
the process is?
So, no, I'm not saying what I think the process is, I'm trying to understand what you think the process is. So, say, there's always headlines 4 times a year or so. Congress passes $700 billion
Okay.
for the Pentagon, and then, the Senate does, and then they increase it by a little bit more. So, just so that I can understand your perspective, is what you're saying that when those bills pass and Congress decides how much to spend, is it that the private banks are then creating that money and giving it to the defense contractors? Is that what your perspective is? What you think happens?
Well, let me say 2 steps.
Okay.
Our government is giving the money to the defense contractors to build what the government is gonna buy from them.
Right.
Now, that money either comes from our taxes or from the federal debt, right? So
Right.
there's no other choice there by our government in order to buy those weapons.
Oh, sorry, I thought what you were saying was that the banks are creating the money to pay the defense contractors to build those weapons.
No, the money's coming from the government to buy those weapons for the government,
Right.
right? Those weapons manufacturers need loans from banks in order to do business. So they go to private commercial banks who are very ready to give them loans.
Can you, I think the public doesn't know about that process, so can
That's
you,
right.
can you expand on that? Like, where can we find that information?
Well,
Is there any-
Right here is one, and in our platform.
But, well, that's just the plowing. Is there any public documents that we can check for that process?
Well, you can go into the SEC, like I said, put in the weapons manufacturer who has a contract with our government, and look at their balance sheet and see, go to how much debt they're in, and then you can go to the notes at the bottom, and they usually tell you which banks have given them those loans.
Okay,
It's very interesting, it opened up my eyes,
interesting.
yeah.
So,
I'm sorry.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
Well, I guess to carry it on, I'm a little confused because the government's paying these contractors.
Or the
Yes.
product after they get it.
So
But
you're
they need
saying
money to build
while they're
factories.
building it, to get there, before they get the money from the government, they need the loan, so they get it from the bank. So that's, okay.
Yeah. We wouldn't have wars if we didn't have this system. I really honestly believe that. You know, I forget someone in history who said, if people had to actually pay for a war, and we're not paying for the war, we're just paying the interest on all the debt our government has gone into over the history of our country, that when a war starts, these banks are always ready to give loans to those weapons manufacturers. And you can actually, there's a man from the American Monetary Institute, he passed away recently, Bob Poteet, but he gave a talk, and he actually charted our national debt, and every time there was a war, the debt went up. And you know that this system is funding those wars, allowing it to happen. If we had to actually pay without, if we had to pay all the money that had to be spent on a war, people would be up in arms, no. But the system keeps it so that, the public is just gonna pay the interest, the government will go more and more into debt, so no one will get really upset. It's like a cover-up.
So are you saying that like the defense contractors are in massive debt to the banks?
I wouldn't say massive debt, but they need those bank loans.
Interesting. I mean, because you can go to the Pentagon's website, right? Every single business day, they have an exact amount that they for a contract with any of the defense contractors. Like literally every day, this is published. So it's interesting that the way that I know people that are federal contractors, and the way that it works is that, at least from their perspective, is that in their commercial bank they get some amount that is their salary, and of course it says the US Treasury. So it doesn't quite say, say Wells Fargo or Chase or anything.
This is contractors who are contracted with the government?
Yeah, so individual contractors, when they get their direct deposit.
Yeah, well,
says-
they would be paid by our government.
But you're saying that's a loan, that's created by the
The
bank.
company, the corporation, it needs money in order to do its business. So the corporation goes to these banks and gets
The government
huge
gives them
loans.
that
The
money, they
government
give it
borrows
back.
the money from the banks and gives it to the corporations.
Say that slower, I'm slowing down myself.
All of this money that the government gets is based on debt. They get it from the banks. They have to borrow from the banks to give it
Well-
to the arms makers.
Now you're going into which is a whole other thing, the process
But that's what
of,
money
wait,
is.
well, wait, what you're getting into is the process of who our national government sells its bonds to in order to get the money to pay the weapons manufacturers. And that's a whole other thing. And ultimately, I agree with you. In the auctions, in the federal auction, the Treasury Department has to sell bonds all the time, it's $20.5 trillion now, right? 7 more really. So, in order to, by law, by the Federal Reserve law, for the federal government, the Treasury can sell and auction bonds to the public, they have to sell them through what they call primary dealers, which are around 20 multinational private commercial banks. TD Bank, my bank is one of them, one of the most recent primary dealers. But you have JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, name any of the big names. They're one of those 20 primary dealers. They have to go through those banks in order to sell to the public. And those banks, they're making money every single auction, they make money. They don't want to stop the system. They want to keep our government in debt. They're making money off of our debt. That's how they do it. Yeah.
But the other side of it, when I pay my taxes that go to pay these defense contractors, or I pay off, my credit card with interest, where did I get the money from? I didn't borrow it.
You earned it.
Right, so where does that money come from?
Well,
Well, I get mine from the US Treasury, so,
you work for the Treasury?
no, I'm old.
Social
I'm a
Security.
pensioner, so, okay,
Social
so,
Security, yeah.
yeah, so, but even if I didn't, I had money in my pocket, where did it come from? If, why does the government print money if the banks create it?
The governments don't print money today. This is the way our money is
The
created.
government doesn't print,
No.
We have mints. We have the Federal Reserve in 12 divisions.
so the US Mint is that business?
No, but it's so little, the coins that they mint is so little.
Because
the
I've
money's
been
so-
told that they still print money.
No, you know what, it's very interesting if you look into the laws. See, yes, our Treasury Department in the mint creates the coins, and we get the face value. Government spends them, and we get the face value of the coins, right? But it's so little of our money supply, right? The Federal Reserve notes, yes, they're printed by the U.S. printing office in the Treasury. But the government sells them to the 12 Federal Reserve banks at the cost of printing, not the face value. We don't get any, the American public doesn't get any value of even the dollar bills, which is still maybe 4 or 5% of our money supply. 95% of our money supply is created this way. Because if you trace back when you were earning money and you trace back where the money came from, you could trace it back to a loan from one of these banks given to an employer.
But I can look at and look at a $5 bill and it says, that it was printed in 17 years.
Yeah,
So-
there's still,
It would be
our
printed
government
money.
is still printing.
That's what I was saying, not creating.
But they're like a printing company. We're not getting any of the face value of that. They're
Okay.
printing it printing it and selling it to 3% to the 12 Federal Reserve banks. They get to give it to them.
No, I get the
They're
process, I'm
very-
just trying to understand this.
Sue, I think I can help possibly, if you
Okay.
want to let me try.
Oh, help.
Sure.
If you look at your money, it says, you know, United States Treasury and all that, but if you look at the top of it, it says Federal Reserve note. This note's issued by the private Federal Reserve banks. It's printed by the United States, and it has the Secretary of the Treasury's signature on it, but it's issued by the Federal Reserve. Now, Rodolfo, I think maybe I can help with your confusion as well. It's like if the government is paying the contractors, then how is it they're getting the money from the banks? So let's follow the money. The money gets loaned into existence by the banking system. Raytheon wants to bid on a new weapons system. So they send a bid to the United States government. The government says, great, we'll buy that weapon system from you. Raytheon then goes to the banks and says, we have a contract to build this weapon systems and we need to capitalize so that we can build the factories. So we need $10 billion. The bank says, great, here's your $10 billion. They build the weapon system. The government wants to pay for that weapon system, so they go to the banks and say, here, buy our bonds. And the bank says, great, here's the $10 billion. And so the government takes that $10 billion, gives it to Raytheon, who gives it back to the bank. So you're starting to see how this works?
Well, so what I'm wondering about is, I mean, thank you for explaining that. So is there, so I know for a fact that the Pentagon website has a list of the contracts. So is there anywhere in the government that we can go check for each Pentagon contract which bank is financing?
No, because the government doesn't care which bank loaned Raytheon the money. All they care about is that when they have to go purchase what Raytheon built with that money.
There's no way to check them?
Well, yeah, you can go to Raytheon on the SEC, that's what she was saying. You can go see who Raytheon borrowed their money from to capitalize their production of that product.
For every single contract, we can check that?
No, for every single corporation.
Yeah.
It's at the corporate level. If that corporation's stocks are traded on a public exchange, by law, they have to give their balance sheet to the SEC.
Right, but the only way that we would be able to check that process that was just outlined would be to check that the contract, each military contract, each project that the Pentagon gives out has a backing
So
from
let's
the bank.
remove it for a second.
Time, it's 2 o'clock.
Oh,
Is there a
okay.
place and time we can carry on this conversation?
Yeah.
That's one.
Yeah, you're
I'm
not getting the
repeating
point.
this.
I want to check
On
it.
Yeah, I
Friday,
know.
I'm
Yeah,
repeating
yeah.
this at Friday at 2:45, but I'm not going to have this. If I will, Friday
Here?
at 2:45 in the guest house, Alpine.
Okay, everybody got
And I
that?
have some handouts for those.
2:45 tomorrow.
The other two handouts are posts that I put on the National Listserv, because I'm an advisor to the National Committee. And it's my describing why not to change the greens, and then a response from the other side. You have these platform changes to this year and are pushing to bringing the dollar out of our platform. So there's 2 of those, and if you want one, you can have that.
But